In the introduction class, the most significant thing that I learned was the competence and joyful chart that described what you're good at and what makes you happy, and how those two together make the golden ticket, but that what you're good at and what you don't enjoy is an unhappy trap to be aware of. In the positive psychology lecture, I found it really interesting to learn about the difference between the Duchenne smile and the Pan Am smile, and I learned that I'm probably too often default to the Pan Am smile, so that's something that I've tried to work on this semester. From the lecture on flourishing, initially I wouldn't have thought that accomplishment would have been an element of well-being because I thought it was a little too worldly for what we were talking about, but in fact it's really important to recognize what we're good at and to build on that. For the Achieving Authentic Happiness lecture, I learned that the need to release anger is a misconception. I still might disagree with that, but I do agree that gratitude is a much better outlet. From the How of Happiness lecture, my takeaway was that it's really important to savor the present moment, because I think being aware of your current happiness is the driver for optimism in the future, as well as greater satisfaction with the past. From the Positivity and Love 2.0 lecture, I found it really interesting that positivity leads to higher thinking. We're greater learners when we have a positive outlook because we're open to new ideas and new processes. The lecture on flow was probably one of my favorites. My awareness of flow before that class was really minimal, but now I find myself thinking about it a lot and thinking of new ways to achieve that through the planning out of the 8 elements and stuff. From the lecture on meaning and achievement, it was really fascinating to me how the concept of meaning has been studied since the beginning of philosophical thinking, yet it continues to change as we develop it. And I think it's important to include eudaimonia in our lives to allow ourselves to flourish and achieve true well-being. I learned from the Happiest Places lecture that thriving is not only about being happy in your current state, but also believing that your happiness will continue to grow for at least the next 5 years. It's a continuing process and not just a temporary feeling. From the Why We Do What We Do lecture, it was really interesting to me that certain things that we see as effective motivators like money and rewards were in fact actually demotivators, because someone's performance was tied to getting something instead of developing the desire to do it. My takeaway from the self-determination theory lecture was that everyone tries to be so different from one another just to prove their independence, but psychology proves that we all crave some level of relatedness, and it goes against our best self to try and deny ourselves dependence upon one another. The time famine lecture, it just baffles me that so many Americans don't take their vacation days, because I think it's really essential to recharge our batteries every once in a while. So keeping this in mind, that's something that I don't want to let myself get caught up in the grind of working. The Take Back Your Time lecture had me realizing that in recent years I've always felt like I'm losing time and not making the most of it. So it was really cool to learn about ways to take back my time, with simple things like keeping a record or slowing down to eat a meal with people. The takeaway from the Building a Good Life in the Digital Age lecture for me was that it's too easy to get overly connected and to let our brains just get too occupied with everything out there when we're not focused enough on what's right in front of us. And we need to create an environment that allows for connected experiences. In the Intentional Families lecture, the best concept for me was that only intentional families have a fighting chance of maintaining an increasing connection. And that just really stuck with me because it's too easy to fall into a comfortable trap of not trying and not having meaning when doing things with your family. In the Family Rituals lecture, I thought it was really interesting that there's 2 different ways to introduce family rituals. And so I started thinking about my own families, and we're definitely the indirect method where we just try stuff, and if we like it, we do it again. And I feel that's honestly the most natural way for stuff to happen, and it leads to the least amount of negative feedback. My favorite takeaway from the Last Child in the Woods lecture was the impact that nature has on a child's development. And how positive it is. And so it's something that I definitely want to implement with my kids and be an example. The experience economy and staging lesson taught me that I'd never realized how many components went into making an experience, but it's really important to hit all of those elements. For example, the engaging all 5 senses, I would never have consciously thought that was something to take into consideration. In the Fostering Empathy lecture, I learned that we tend to self-justify a lot more than we realize, and therefore we're betraying ourselves, and we become convinced that there's no responsibility or control. My takeaway from the Design Thinking lecture was that I need to look for creativity in other places aside from artistic areas. and that it's also important to visualize our thinking process to gain a better understanding of our goals. The Designing Your Life lecture showed me that I'm kind of letting my life design like slip through my fingers in a way, and that I'm not really taking the opportunity to find my passions like I should. The lesson on wayfinding and Odyssey plans was really insightful, especially through the mind mapping activity, because it allowed my creativity to flow. And I think all too often people are caught up in what they should be doing, me included, so we don't allow our minds to just breathe. The takeaway from the prototyping lesson for me was that there are so many other ways to do prototyping outside of just researching or simply trying it. The Choosing Happiness lecture probably had my most favorite concept in it, and that was the idea that we need to just move on and let go when making decisions, because we can't really be happy as long as we're like worrying over if we made the right decision or not. So we need to just jump in with both feet and look for the happiness in it.